Creativity, the spark that has built our world. But what does it mean to be a creative person? In the time of Mad Men, art seemed to be everywhere. Incredible art came out of this time, and even something we wouldn't think of as art in modern times, advertising, became art. In modern times, there are more artists than ever before, but art is hated. Between business and social movements, the general malaise and discomfort of modern times because of technology and other forces, art is just a three-letter word now. We can make more than ever before, and yet nothing is quality or makes us feel in a meaningful way. Everything seems to be political or way too commercial, but this isn't some sinister cabal. It's because art is a reflection of reality, and reality isn't comfortable these days. In Mad Men, we see the reflection of the post-war society still being shaped, and how advertising did that. The reason the power of that world still endures is because those creatives engaged with the creative process to create simple, enduring messages. They were able to do what modern creatives can't, despite having access to greater resources. People like Don Draper really existed, and they built our world as we knew it for a long time. They did so by engaging with the creative process. They experimented and left room for uncertainty and strangeness, as art should. There was an interesting divide between the more mainstream creative work, like the work of Madison Avenue, and less commercial creative work, like the beatnik hippie types that created art in a more traditional medium, such as painting or writing. But both went on to define the time they lived in and build the one we live in today. Mad Men explores the power of the creative process, the ways in which it makes and unmakes our world through both mainstream and offbeat mediums. It offers a roadmap through the creative process into changing our world by choice rather than circumstance, as it is often changed by these days. Their world was experimental and often strange, a butting up of the old world and the new. But most of all, the 60s were a masterclass in world building, rather than this moment, which is a masterclass in world destruction. So put on your berets and smoke 'em if you got 'em, because this is the world of Mad Men. Mad Men, a TV show that came to define both the 1960s and the Obama presidency, is a modern classic. What more could be said of something so well done? Well, there really isn't much more to say, but in a recent rewatch, I found myself envious of the decade. Ironically, I didn't watch it when it originally aired because of the obvious and patent sexism, so I know I'm romanticizing the time in an unhealthy fashion. Upon deeper inspection, I realized what was really spiking my envy was the level of creativity that was present throughout the show. The 60s were known for being an experimental time, and this is something that we really need in modern times. If YouTube is any indication, everything is about comfortable money making. Even things that seem experimental, like certain modern artists, seem like remixes of what was once popular. This isn't a diss on any particular artist in modern times. I'm sure their work is at least good in its own way, but creative work shouldn't just be about what's popular and consistently financially successful. This is something that Don Draper, despite his flaws, really understood well. Even though he was a messed up guy, he did some interesting creative work. This was a time when, much to the chagrin of traditional artists, advertising became a kind of low art. It was about being creative, expressing ideas, when capitalism wasn't just a dirty concept, but rather a means to build a new world in the ravages of the post-war era. Of course, many artistic types didn't like capitalism, but many people did like it because the newfound prosperity of the time. It meant material goods and security, something those who lived through the Depression never knew. Through advertising, these people created the post-war world that we have all come to know. The norms, standards, beliefs, hopes, and dreams of this world were shaped and reshaped by what came to be a kind of art, for better or worse. It was serendipitous that as I was rewatching this, I was also reading Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way every day, the original concept of which she came up with in the 1970s in New York. Julia Cameron is, to say the least, a prolific writer and creative coach. You can find a ton of information out there about her, and if you are a budding creative, she should be your North Star, in my opinion. She wrote The Artist's Way in the 1970s after teaching the core concepts of her philosophy in many workshops. It is technically a self-help book, but not in the true sense. It's a 12-week program which helps people who wish to be creative find a pathway to recovering their creativity, whether it's painting, writing, sculpting, acting, sewing, you name it. She doesn't promise success or security, but a means to a happier life by unearthing one's natural creative impulses nuances which are often buried by modern society's expectations. Being a creative person is not easy. Even though we are all born creative, we are expected to get jobs, have kids, work, and we lose that part of ourselves. In Julia's program, over 12 weeks, the reader learns how to be okay with making bad art, how to stop judging oneself, and how to allow joy and creativity into life. Even in 2025, when the world is so different from when the text was originally written, it holds up well. There are two important tenets of this program, one of which is almost impossible to adhere to, and I believe is the reason for the struggles of creativity in modern times. Number one, the morning pages, is the ability to sit every morning as early as possible in the day and write 3 pages by hand without stopping. Not creative work, but whatever comes to mind. Whining, complaining, obsessing, until finally you have an idea for whatever creative work you're trying to do. Julia believes that there is a creative spirit that we all have access to. It's not religious, but you can call it God if you like. It's about opening oneself up to that ethereal energy. The epiphanies from this process are most accessible early in the day, when the noise of the world hasn't gotten into one's head yet, and morning pages are the easiest way to find them. They say that inspiration comes when we're not looking, but it must find us working. This is the work necessary to find inspiration. The second tenet, the media blackout, in which one does not read, watch TV, or engage with social media or any other forms of media, no exceptions. Julia outlines the specifics of this. You can still call people and check email and do work, but no noise to block out the voice of spirit coming through. Many great creatives use these among others of her techniques. In fact, working on a computer that was not connected to the internet is how Christopher Nolan wrote Oppenheimer. It's also why many creatives have typewriters and prefer to work as analog as possible. These two basic tenets of creativity are missing among many modern creatives, even the ones who are successful. In Don Draper's time, it wasn't that modern media didn't exist, but it wasn't nearly as ubiquitous. It's damn near impossible these days to exist outside of TV, radio, social media, the internet, and more forms of media like podcasts. And if you can't find ways to hear the voice of the muse, then you end up remixing stuff, going political, or doing disgusting things for shock value. It's funny to me that everyone thinks the slew of reboots, sequels, remixes, gender-bent properties, and more rehashes of old media properties in ever more political and often absurd ways are part of some sinister cabal, when in fact it's just creative laziness. And by creative laziness, I don't mean that creatives need to work harder, but rather not rely so much on AI or machines or forcing productivity. Modern creativity cares more about the results, usually financial or parasocial, rather than the process or meaning of what it is to create. Julia talks about this in another facet of the program, the artist states, in which creatives simply treat themselves to something that refills their well. Activities like walking or going to a restaurant or a bookstore. Small, simple things that help creatives to rest and recharge so that they can produce good work. It's about learning to appreciate life and creative work as a process, not just the finished product. It's about taking time off to rest and daydream, to play meaningfully, not mindlessly, and being open to failure and reworking rather than instant perfection. It means not seeking creative comfort, but taking risks, being bold and daring, things we just don't seem to have room for anymore. I know I keep using the word creative here. In my mind, it means anyone who makes art, writes, acts, makes films, but frankly, if any of these things sound familiar to you, if this video makes you feel seen in some way, then this is probably you. Of course, most budding creatives will never admit to being artists because of the imposter syndrome that runs rampant through creative communities. In the suburbs, being someone of creative persuasion is almost completely unacceptable because creative work generally doesn't pay the bills, given its mercurial financial nature. It is the mark of a civilized society if creative work is viewed with value. That is the difference between the Renaissance and 2025. If we follow Don Draper's world, we can see some true creativity. Again, not because the time was any better, but because there was this open sense of experimentation and an ability to hear the creative muse. Also, since there has been so much said on this series, I'd like to be targeted here. So I'm going to say one more thing, because I think it's the best way to get my point across about the importance of creative thought. My prayer is that someone will see this, pick up the artist's way, and rather than being envious that I didn't live through the artistic explosion of the 20th century, maybe we can all ignite a new one, because I know I'm not the only one who wants that change. While we can learn a great deal about creativity from Julia Cameron's work, to be a creative is to live it. When you make make art or write, when you craft or design something, you fall into a flow state. It's problem solving and expressing one's worldview and ideas all at once. We can get wrapped up in the ego and believe we are geniuses. We can see the reality and believe that we are vessels. Technically, both are true. It becomes a way to honor one's connection to the universe, to acknowledge that humans are more than just these physical beings on Earth. Now, the work at Sterling Cooper is hardly that poetic all the time, and creative work is not always glamorous. Sometimes it's pitching a client a brilliant idea that changes their perspective on their product. Sometimes it's banging your head against the desk because all the ideas mentioned in the brainstorm are trash. It's the creative process, and there's nothing easy about it. Mad Men really helps to highlight that. We've never been more creatively able. Paint and materials have never been cheaper or more accessible in human history. And yet, I find that the culture is unsatisfying, because all of this availability is the problem. A wise man once told me, limitations breed creativity. I used to know someone who had every piece of crafting supplies you could imagine. A chunk of her house was filled with pens, markers, alcohol inks, everything you could think of. In the years I knew her, she never once did anything with the materials she accumulated. And it's not like she was doing anything else. She would talk endlessly about the creative projects that she might do, but never start one. And this is indicative of the culture we live in. We think that the materials will give us the ideas rather than nurturing the ideas. We're so afraid to fail that we just spend time watching artist content of other people making stuff. And usually they're not doing anything unique. It's just something perfectly beautiful like calligraphy or landscapes. Limitations on materials, lack of focus, loafing around, trial and error and failure are so important to this process. And it is a process. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. It seems unwelcome in modern times. When time is equal to productivity, how is there room to daydream about the next big world-changing idea? Especially when big data can quickly tell you what to do next. So what is the creative process? What are the hallmarks of a creative person? We see this in season 4 with the advent of the new agency. From the selfishness of finding time to make art or write, the imposter syndrome, the doubt, and the fear of making a mistake, to the challenges of finding inspiration and coping with distractions like drugs and alcohol. The life of a creative worker is never dull. When the core team at Sterling Cooper becomes PPL and then is forced out, Don is forced to open Sterling Cooper Draper Price. And we can see how the limits of the new firm breed creativity. Don and the rest of the company are desperate to drum up business. So during the first year, he and his colleagues, including Peggy, do some fascinating work. They are motivated by their desire to do good creative work rather than simply skating by on work that is good enough. The creative team at SCDP is intense, aggressive, and Don is unrelenting in his pursuit of perfection. They are obsessive and selfish, but creativity is, unfortunately, a selfish endeavor. Julia says it best in The Artist's Way. If you're on the path to creative recovery, you're going to tick some people off. You need the time alone, with your thoughts, swimming, walking, going to the movies, mulling over thoughts to get the ideas out. People in life feel entitled to each other's time, but creative work requires that time. Time you might spend taking care of difficult friends or relatives, time spent doing pointless tasks to make other people happy, time spent doom scrolling and worrying about the fate of humanity. All of that has to go into creative work and rest. It costs Don and Peggy their personal lives, and even the other creatives on the team don't have much going on outside of work. To do good creative work requires dedication, weekends, family time lost, but it doesn't feel like anything is lost. I think sometimes these people are happier to be at work than they are at home. Even the non-creative people in the office talk about the joy of the challenges of work. It allows them to be totally selfish in their pursuit of creative excellence. But it can also make you a temperamental artiste. Don is guilty of letting his selfishness bleed into other aspects of his life, like when the company finally gets the Jaguar account after a great personal sacrifice and the man turns out to be rude and uncouth. Don rips him a new one. He is foolish in suggesting that Don take advice from some young kid on a national ad campaign. Don is rightfully offended, but does not think of his co-workers, namely Joan, who suffered deep indignity to secure the account. He leaves the account and can only think of the next account when the rest of the office forces him to take responsibility for his selfishness. Mitigating the selfish nature of creative work with the cooperative nature of business is challenging, and the push and pull between doing good creative work and using business to get it out into the world is a tale as old as time. Don pulls a similar stunt with The Letter, when he promises to stop doing business with Big Tobacco after American Tobacco pulls their account from the agency unexpectedly. It is a bold creative move. It gets people talking, and it puts SCDP on the map in many ways, but it also is a deeply selfish move, one that sabotages the agency in many ways as well. They can never take another tobacco account, and it makes other accounts weary of SCDP's lack of loyalty. This double-edged sword is tricky to navigate in creative life. We need that single-mindedness to create things, but can suffer at the hands of it if it runs wild, especially because most creatives, including Don, suffer from massive imposter syndrome. Often, the most difficult part of being a creative is the uncreative parts, as if it isn't hard enough to make something from nothing. Then you must convince people that it has value. In Season 4, Episode 1, fresh off the team's success with a Glow Coat ad campaign, Don is asked to do an interview to bolster the new agency, SCDP. He fails hopelessly, and his false modesty loses them an important account with the Highlight Association. Privately, he can be creative. He can have that selfishness that is necessary to be a solid creative. But in public, he's embarrassed and uncomfortable with the bravado that being a creative leader requires. After a failed presentation with a bathing suit company, he takes another interview, and this time fakes it till he makes it. Every creative would like to think that their work speaks for itself, but unfortunately it doesn't. Promotion, speaking about the work, even just owning up to it can be so hard. This speaks to the tension in creatives, the desire to be seen but also hidden. The work ends up defining our identities, whether we intend for it to or not. Don Draper is the mask that Dick Whitman wears. Successful, handsome, wealthy, his creative work is an extension of that persona. As Dick Whitman, he is deeply insecure about his lower-class upbringing and difficult childhood. There are other ways to interpret this divide in his identity, but among creatives, everyone feels that way. Whether it was Norma Jean Baker and Marilyn Monroe, or Cary Grant and Archibald Leach, the work can create an identity for you, and then you have to live up to it, and it's incredibly stressful. Creatives will often talk about the pain of this tension, the fear of it, because the work does not always speak for itself. Even with all of his success, Don struggles with finding his inspiration. They all do. The ephemeral nature of creativity makes it difficult to fit into a capitalist system obsessed with security and stability. Sometimes one can have every idea, and other times there are dry spells. Creative work is not always secure. Back in the 60s, when the stakes were lower, it must have been much easier to do that sort of work. Nowadays, with million-dollar contracts, social media, and the endless money machine pumping out ads of all types, there is little creativity in ad work. It's a lot of nostalgia, politics, and general nonsense. It's the same problem in other forms of media, but somehow we keep consuming it all out of addiction. So how do we cope with that? Engaging with the creative process is hard, it's stressful, and people are prone to look for an easy fix. While there are lots of other ways to be creative, the easiest one that many people reach for is marijuana. And in the 60s, weed, LSD, all kinds of stuff were floating around, but it can end up being a distraction, just like the media these days. Drugs and alcohol are both a muse and a distraction for creatives since the dawn of time. At its best, things like marijuana have been known, colloquially, to bolster creativity. However, they can also end up a terrible distraction by way of addiction. Don's artist friend Midge is a great example of this. A traditional artist in the village, she marries a man who convinces her to try heroin, and she ends up addicted to it. It's disheartening to see that happen to her. As an old school beatnik type, she brought a different energy to the show. But it happens to Don as well when, after his divorce, his drinking becomes out of control. He blacks out many times, even sleeping with his secretary and not remembering it. Everyone at these agencies drinks to the point of madness, it seems, as that was also the culture at that time. I once read somewhere that in the 60s, DUIs were not taken as seriously as they are today, and were regarded more as rites of passage. Regardless, substances can be distracting and destructive, which is why Don stops drinking for a while. Don is like many creative people, highly sensitive to the world around him, seeing things like a transparent eyeball, taking it all in and making something new. He's a pretty emotional guy, though terrible at expressing himself, and all while feeling so much. He is incredibly hard on himself. Not just creatively, he has this built-in shame from his childhood that he just can't let go of. So he works hard to bury his feelings and be perfect. His perfect image is an extension of his creative ability. He wanted desperately to be that perfect assimilationist robot, and so he became it. Pretty much everyone expects him to be that person. His ex-wife Betty, when she thinks she might have cancer, Roger when he's on his LSD trip, they all envision a man who is perfectly coiffed, totally put together, and will make every everything okay. It doesn't matter if they know better, if they have seen him falling apart, breaking down emotionally. Only that image of him is what is real, which is something that makes creative ability more powerful than we can imagine. Creative people have the power to make the world, even ourselves, into anything we want. Our ability to imagine our world into existence through creative work, like writing or art, is something that we dismiss foolishly in modern times. Don's dual identity is very much about the assimilationist mentality of America at that time. In our world, our differences are celebrated and encouraged, following the cultural shift towards identity politics and multiculturalism. But in Don's time, it was all about conformity with a few wealthy people. The whiter, Protestant, and wealthier you were, the better your life was. Dick Whitman's choice to become Donald Draper was based in this fact. He needed to destroy his poor roots, every way in which he was unacceptable to the mainstream culture of the time, so that he could have material and social success. But one could argue that this is also representative of a kind of creative duality, the feeling that all creatives have of never being good enough, of always striving for more, to do more, and be more, to be really hard on oneself, and to change as necessary in any way possible for creative success. I think the best example of this is actually from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, in which Leonardo DiCaprio plays an aging movie star cast in a TV role as a villain for a Western. He struggles to get his lines right, and so he goes back to his trailer and this happens. Now, while what happens here is humorous, it's also very realistic. Creative people are so hard on themselves, and it's usually not this funny. Don breaks himself apart to make the identity he wants at work, and he consistently hurts himself trying to find the right idea for his campaigns. There is one instance where he keeps thinking about an ad from his old job, one that never existed. It was his memory from childhood. He literally drives himself mad, searching for something not real, because he's convinced that's the answer. Creatives can drive themselves insane trying to find the perfect idea, the right solution to a creative problem. It's a part of the process, because that's just how it is when you do creative work and put yourself out there in that way. You're never quite certain, but you have to do it. And I do find myself wondering sometimes, what compels me and other people to be like this? In 2022, David Harbour from Stranger Things was on First We Feast, the popular interview show where people eat hot wings and talk about life. And he said something that was so interesting to me. When asked what words of enlightenment he had for other budding creatives, he said, "Only do it if you have to do it." He didn't like that he had heard other actors say that in the past, and he swore that he would never say that. But as time went on, he found himself saying it anyways. Because you could have a happy, simple life doing anything else. You should only do creative work because you need to do it, not because you want to be famous. You should only do it because you have something to express inside of you. And this is what drives creatives. We just can't help ourselves. And that's the thing. This is what drives creatives. We just can't help ourselves. Which is why, and it might be a bit of a cold thing to say, but I'll say it anyway, don't do creative work of any kind if you don't have to. Don's most interesting creative moment has less to do with the campaign and more to do with the way he handled the Japanese clients from Honda. They come in for a pitch, and Roger offends them by being racist and rude. The team knows they don't have a chance with a client this big, so they trick the competition into spending their budget. Then, they drop out of the running by claiming that the Japanese didn't honor their rules, which specified no finished work. In this way, SCDP gets the contract for the car, which was in development at the time. It's interesting. Don is a man with a singular vision for his company. He wants to do great creative work that not only makes money, but also shakes up the creative world. Nothing else matters, but it's not toxic, it's clever and interesting. And creativity should be cutting edge. The Pond's campaign is what originally sparked my idea for this video. People don't know what they want, and in giving them the same thing over and over again, we regurgitate the culture until everyone is choking on it, much like modern times. But to create something new, you have to be a person with a vision. To have a vision, you must be connected to the creative muse. These days, even beyond creative work and media, there are few new ideas under the sun. AI is this lack of creativity coming to a head, a vision for a future that doesn't just require not thinking, but also disconnecting from the muse in any form. I say vision is important because people had it at this time. A great example of this comes from an unlikely and distinctly uncreative place, the White House. Here, Doris Kearns Goodwin, historian and wife of famous speechwriter Dick Goodwin, explains how LBJ, the president of the US during the 60s, articulated his vision for the nation, not Kennedy's or anyone else's, his vision. He called Dick and others to the White House pool for an important meeting. Swimming naked in the pool, he invited the other men to join him. There, from the edge of the pool, he explained his goals for the future, which Dick Goodwin placed under the banner that we've come to know as the Great Society. Everything from Medicare, Medicaid, aid to education, immigration reform, civil rights, voting rights, NPR, PBS, and all of this from the edge of a pool. I mean, I knew that LBJ had these ideas, but I didn't know that he had them while swimming naked in a pool. To me, it speaks to the freedom of the 60s, the ability to build something new after the destruction of the war. The world was still recovering. Colonized countries were still throwing off their shackles. The population pyramid was healthy, and there was an immense hope for the future. Perhaps I ask too much of creatives and leaders in modern times. This moment is not the moment of the visionaries, but of endurance and survival. For those who have vision, these times are unbearable. As a society, we cannot have a vision because we are suspicious of the future. It was funny watching the Beatles' last music video because it featured AI versions of George and John. In modern times, we have become, rightfully so, suspicious of new technology. But in the time of the Beatles, new technology was exciting, and as they were a youth-oriented band, everything they did would have been cutting edge, because the future wasn't a scary thing. At least, not for young people at that time. Some people might dismiss the Beatles for being overly commercial, but I think because capitalism, and well, everything at that time, wasn't just about greed, but about building a new world, you can reconcile advertising as art. Maybe business was always bad. I don't know. I didn't live in the 60s. But now it's become even more corrupt, nepotistic, and delusional. And while people have always complained about its problematic nature, I can't imagine it was as bad as it is today. In the world of Mad Men, people cared about their products. Even the beans, vinegars, and sauces division of Heinz, which is headed by this ding-dong here, cared about his product. He rejected at least 3 different advertising ideas before he finally settled, and the idea ended up winning an award for the agency. If you have ever owned anything vintage, then you will understand the quality of a piece. If you don't believe me, go to your local antique mall and ask them to show you some of their best pieces, because the world back then had standards. Capitalism wasn't just about making money, but making things and services better and better. People saw excellence and perfection in the work that they did. Things had meaning, perhaps because life had meaning. It's a struggle to imagine such a world in modern times where cheap plastic goods dominate the market. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Why did companies put so much more into their goods than they do these days? Well, I can't speak for any other time in human history, but in this time, it seems like it's less about the products and more about the world being built by those products. It's not about capitalism or advertising. It's about building the boundaries of the new world. It seemed to be about making a world different from everything before World War II because of the destructive nature of the events of that war. Whether they are doing it purposefully or by accident, the marketing and advertising happening here is creating a new world. New norms, behaviors, ways of being are being born from their products. Take, for example, Peggy's ketchup ad, in which she effectively obliterates catsup. We never hear about it anymore, not in any sort of meaningful way. Whether an advertising campaign was responsible or not, it's an interesting way to think about change in the world. In the case of Belle Jolie lipstick, this is where Peggy gets her chance to be a copywriter. It's a lipstick, and feminists would argue that's problematic because it peddles the idea that women themselves are not enough. But in Peggy's campaign, Mark Your Man, women are individuals, not just one of 1,000 colors in a box. It was a bold way of thinking during that time, that a woman wanted to feel that her shade made her stand out. It was about her unique personality represented by a shade of lipstick.
Every woman wants choices, but in the end, none wants to be one of 100 in a box. She's unique. She makes the choices, and she's chosen him. She wants to tell the world, he's mine. He belongs to me, not you. She marks her man with her lips. He is her possession. You've given every girl that wears your lipstick the gift of total ownership.
Or teaching women to use skincare. I never knew that women just didn't wash their faces, as Megan describes in the Secretary's Focus Group. Women had to be taught to use razors and cold cream, and in recent years, a full skincare routine. Yes, there's a certain level of greed pushing this idea, but it changed everything. It has become linked with hygiene and femininity, and advertising had a lot to do with that. In the case of the cold cream, unfortunately, they are perpetuating an old idea about women and marriage based solely on data, but it made women into consumers with buying power and the capacity to have rights. The advertising campaigns began to reflect the changing social norms. It was kind of a top-down, bottom-up mentality. Social change happened on the streets, but then it would show up in advertising campaigns as well. It was really interesting when you think about it that way. Or the Never Done Hilton campaign, because Hilton turned out to be a loon, in which Don ties the idea of Hilton with the idea of travel and new places, thereby expanding upon the idea of globalization. The campaign ties together America and American ideals like hamburgers and luxury towels with places that were exotic in the 60s, like Japan and Iran. It pushes forward both global connections that were becoming commonplace at the time, as well as American imperialism, something Conrad Hilton claimed he wanted in the series. All of these campaigns also examine concepts in our society and thereby force us to examine them. Why is a cartoon pig getting hit with a snowball funny and an effective advertisement for a refreshing drink called Snowball? Or more deeply, what is nostalgia and what does it tell us about ourselves? Don is the most tied to this, as he has multiple story arcs where he confronts aspects of his past through products, such as the carousel, a slideshow projector for viewing photos that he sells as the wheel, a way to go back in time. For him, it allows him to remember meeting and falling in love with his wife, the early days of his family, before he started cheating and things fell apart. Or the Hershey campaign, one that is never seen, which examines our ideas of love in chocolate. It's interesting that Don ties it at first to the feeling others love, and then, in a moment of rare honesty, with the sense of normalcy he never had as a child. Growing up in a cat house, poor, unwanted, orphaned, Don never felt good enough, but having a Hershey's made him feel that he was a child like any other. The most important campaign is the one that we never see, which is Don's visualization at the end of the series. It's just an advertisement for a sugary syrup, but the Coca-Cola ad that Don goes on to work on is a culmination of the dream of the 60s, one that was limited by the deaths of so many civil rights leaders throughout that time. That dream of unity still persists. At that point, it was specifically the idea that capitalist democracies could help us cut past our differences, because everyone likes Coca-Cola. In fact, Coca-Cola itself was so symbolic for so many years of the spread of capitalism and democracy. Places like India that didn't liberalize economically until the 90s saw Coke as one of the first imported food products. Obviously, products are just products, but whether we like it or not, they are tied to our memories and our families and our personal as well as social histories. And it's interesting that advertising examines all of that. Advertising creates these worlds that we live in, but then we live in them, and the advertising and the product become a part of it. It's this back and forth dichotomy where both the world is created for us and we also create the world by engaging with it. All of this is to say that creative thought can be used for both manipulation or amplification of a message. For better or for worse, advertising changed America and eventually the world. New products changed norms for women, again, for better or for worse. Both Cool Whip and margarine, both products made popular by advertising, are fake food, essentially. Both are campaigns that Sterling Cooper works on, obfuscating the truth of their nature, convincing the consumer that they were healthy and wholesome products. Don literally pitches the margarine campaign as a dairy farmer's wife serving breakfast with it instead of butter. Margarine isn't the most popular thing in my grocery store, but Country Crock, I Can't Believe It's Not Butter, and Smart Balance are all popular variations on it. There are so many interesting examples of manipulating a message as well, but one that stood out to me was in the first season, when the state of Israel comes to Sterling Cooper asking for help in turning the Israeli Riviera into a hot tourist destination. They cite this text, Exodus, as being on the US bestseller list for years. It is an interesting piece of propaganda for the state of Israel and the plight of the Jewish people over decades. It has informed many Americans' ideas about the region. The book's message may even persist today, given the age of many lawmakers and decision makers and their choice to back Israel in the current conflict. And that is the power of being creative. Anyone could have written a propaganda pamphlet for the government or some other nonsense, but a text that told a story that captured the imagination of the American people has helped to make the ties between the US and Israel strong over decades. Now, obviously, there are other reasons for US connections with the state of Israel, but this is an example of how creative work can be used to make propaganda and sway people in one direction. I can't say that it's any better or worse than similar pieces written from the Arab point of view, but it certainly is an interesting idea that well-created, successful pieces of media can serve as strong propaganda, for better or worse. In this moment in time, when people are railing against all of these changes, against all of the changes that were made by the creative minds of the past, I have to remind them that the world we have now was built in the 50s and 60s. It's interesting because I wrote this before the election, and now with the results of the election, it is interesting to see people railing against modernity that their ancestors created. Turning the clock back to a world that is nothing but clean and pure is not going to be so simple. It requires creativity, and all we have in the anti-modern food, anti-vaccines, and anti-government camp is hatred and a desire to destroy. There is none of the creativity of madmen present, and there will be a moment in which the people who believe in the incoming government will find themselves disillusioned with its lack of ability to do anything. So what is really the point of creativity? Why have this conversation? I know that people in my life have repeatedly told me, point blank, that creative work serves no purpose in the real adult world. Or you have the opposite, in which today is the most creative the world has ever been because of the widespread tools and technology available to make anything that we want, but everything is made to be sold. True creativity only exists in a specific world, one that is filled with experimentation, freedom, and the security to do so. Creativity isn't just about the process, it's about what it gives to those who are outside of it. In viewing a creative work, there is an exchange between the creator and the viewer. The strangeness of art and the liberal mindset around it is usually non-judgmental, non-conformist, and open to new ideas and ways of being. We might take it for granted in America, but creativity affords us our freedom and vice versa. Writing ads or making paintings isn't just important to world building, it's important in other ways as well. We needn't look further than Lane's story to understand. Lane Price is an executive brought over from England who follows Sterling Cooper and Draper to the new firm after leaving PPL. He comes from stodgy, conservative, and frankly horrifying roots. His family is classist, snobby, and provincial, and this is a struggle for Lane as he loves America. It's obvious that he prefers the relaxed attitude of Americans, not worrying about his status or if his upper lip is stiff enough. Lane is a sensitive guy, and in the overly masculine era of the 60s, he is ridiculed for it. Women like Joan and even his girlfriend at the Playboy Club, Tony, can see the value of it because in America, there are places where it is allowed. Lane becomes estranged from his wife as they grow apart during their time in America, so she moves back to England for a while. Lane begins seeing Tony, a black woman and a bunny at the Playboy Club. He's happy and successful until his insane father shows up and beats him into fixing his marriage and giving up his happiness with Tony. Lane feels immense pressure in his marriage, in his family, and from the community to succeed in a conventional sense because he is a man who uprooted his family. Ultimately, the pressure costs him his life when he makes the mistake of stealing from the firm to cover his taxes. He was too embarrassed to ask for a loan when he needed it and instead forged Don's signature. It's an absolute disaster, but it proves my point about the importance of creativity. In an open and creative culture, as was the case in New York at the time, Lane thrived. Despite never quite fitting in the more macho parts of the office, he was happy, free to make a public spectacle when he wanted, and beat up his obnoxious coworker, date outside of his background. The buttoned-up, stiff culture of Britain would never allow any of that, and we see that in the kind of art that came out of New York. Creativity helps to foster a more liberal and relaxed culture, one that can be egalitarian and meritocratic, one that allows men like Lane to exist more freely. We take it for granted in America, and I think that's why some foolish conservative ideas are growing again. People here have no idea the pressure of a truly racist, sexist, classist, repressed, and stodgy culture. We take for granted that we can speak to anyone we wish without reprisal or act as we please in public. Cultures and communities that are truly stuck in the past are un-American, and as someone who has lived through things like that, I can honestly say openness and joy are so much better. And that is what is lost in those communities. But of course, they would never know. In a place like England, it's just how it is, even if it's wrong. Even in America, Lane is not completely free of the restrictions of England. Owing taxes to the crown because he put that money into the firm to keep it alive, he is unable to get past his own pride and ask for his bonus when he needs it. The pride of being a respectable man who doesn't doesn't ask for anything. The stifling, constricting boundaries of traditional English masculinity causes him to steal the money from the firm by forging Don's signature. When he's caught, Don feels he has no choice but to fire him, a very traditionally masculine move. Don, while living in this liberal culture and being liberated by it, chooses to stay quite conservative sometimes, and it is exhausting. Lane is incapable of living within these boundaries, these stifling expectations as a sensitive soul, and so he takes his own life, leaving nothing but a boilerplate resignation letter behind. The creative spark lives within all of us, giving ourselves space to hear the voice of the muse, the time to rest and relax, to be inspired and open is a rare thing these days. Creativity offers us something that we desperately need in modern times. We need meaning as much as we need oxygen, and for some reason, we hold our collective breath every day and go through life choking, coughing and wheezing through the pollution of meaninglessness. We believe that somehow we can live without it, without being human, and then wonder why things are the way they are. Through Mad Men, we see the true challenges of creative work. While people tend to dismiss creative work of all types as nonsense, this is because they don't know the process of it. They don't understand the integral value of how art builds our world. From the imposter syndrome to the need for rest that is denied to creatives, to the tension of wanting to be seen but also hidden as a creative. Most folks have no clue that even this work of advertising as art was so taxing. If I haven't made it clear yet, despite being about advertising, Mad Men is also about creativity and world building. It's about building a new, comfortable world in which people are free to make choices about who they want to be and what is important. It's not about endless money, but about life. I think this is best encapsulated in Don's vision of Bert Cooper after he passes away. Don sees Bert dancing around the office, singing "The best things in life are free," because even though he was a devout ad man, a possible follower of Ayn Rand, blue-blooded, and a serious business leader, in death, his greatest message to Don is to remember what really matters. Advertising, just like capitalism, should be a means to an end, and that end always has been and always will be life. The most important part of creativity that nobody likes to think about is that it teaches us about life. Creativity is a process. It takes time, energy, failure, and it's never perfect. It is agony in many ways to always be striving, just like life. We are driven by internal and external forces to seek better things for ourselves and those we love, and we become angry when those things don't happen, whether it's the basics or the extra, a house and a paycheck or the best job at the company or making it to the moon. But creativity teaches us that life is a process and that with time, we will be okay. The whole toxic idea that we must have a perfect order of operations to our lives, to go to school, get married, have children, on some social time clock, is made literal nonsense when engaging with the creative process. Because neither success nor failure matter when doing creative work. Only the process, the back and forth, the up and down. And that is the magic of life. Art made with the creative process is a gift given only to us humans. And I don't know about you, but I think it makes us and our existence pretty special. Maybe someday we can finally live up to our creative potential as a species. At the end of the series, we see each character's life wrapped up neatly, achieving something meaningful for that person. But for none of them is it an ending, because life doesn't work that way. Everyone's best work is still ahead of them, and we see that in Don's vision. Thank you so much for watching. Do you feel inspired to be more creative? No matter how bad you think you are, your work, your life has value as a part of this vast universe. So don't watch any more videos today. Disconnect from the internet and go write that thing you've been putting off. Take that class and make that painting. The only person judging you is you. Happy creating, and see you in the next one. Bye!